Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Four Shots of Kajukenbo, and today we are talking about a man that many consider to be among the greatest swordsmen in Japan's history. He was also really good at pissing people off, like some Kajukenbo people I know. So, kick your feet up, get your shots ready, and enjoy the show. Today we're talking about Miyamoto Musashi. All right, so welcome back. This is Four Shots. Today we are talking history, and as usual, we're doing our show in the Four Shots format. We're going to take some shots throughout the show to help mark the passage of time. So be sure to feel free to drink along with us. Let us know in the comments what you think. Our returning guest today, the returning champion, Professor Alex Bennett. Alex is a longtime kendo practitioner. He's also got experience in other traditional classical Japanese weapons, and he is a professor of Japanese history at Kansai University in Osaka, Japan. Last time he joined us to talk about the legalities of self-defense in a little bit in America, but largely in Japan as well. So thank you for joining us, Alex. I was really afraid we scared you off last time.
Ah, yeah. When was that actually, John? How many years ago was
Ooh,
that now?
maybe
That
two
that sort of
years.
was that during the pandemic or a little bit just after it, perhaps?
Might have been. I think it's a little bit after the pandemic. It's a while back now. Definitely some
Yeah,
time.
yeah, sure. Right, yeah, indeed. Self-defense, the legalities of it. Well, that's something
Right.
that Miyamoto Musashi didn't have to worry too much about, that's for sure.
And we'll be talking about that as duels. All of his duels were like to the death, weren't they?
Well, not all of them, but yeah, fair few for sure.
We'll talk about that for sure. Also joining us today for the first time is representing Kajukenbo alongside me is the artist formerly known as Kekoa. He's still known as Kekoa. I just like calling him that and comparing him to Prince. Kekoa, for those who don't know who you are, can you tell us real quick how long you've been doing Kaju and what your lineage is?
It's been about 38 years in Kajukenbo. I started off with great grandmaster James Juarez when he was, I don't know, somewhere further younger down the line. Not quite a great grandmaster back then, just a regular Sifu. From there, I studied under Ron Steller and branched out and took a bunch of other different martial arts as well. About it.
Awesome. And just so you know, Alex, Ron Esteller is my instructor. James Juarez is his instructor. And Juarez is the guy who actually got me interested in Musashi. He's the one who lent me his book Shogun and then this Eiji Yoshikawa book that really got
Yep.
me started on this.
Uh-huh.
So that's where we are for the show. Kiko is an awesome artist, by the way. I'm going to hopefully convince him to show some links at the end of the show, not only his OnlyFans, if that's, we're not going to go that way. All right, if you guys are ready, we'll do our first shot and we'll do our start.
Oh, hang on a minute, mate. You already filled yourself up there.
Every time this happens, one person.
Oh, there you go. No, no. Just
What do you
before,
got today?
I'll tell you what I've got. I've got cider.
Okay.
Uh, actually, I can't even. There we go.
There
It's
it is.
apple cider flavored with ginger. So it's alcoholic, but it's kind of healthy. Yeah, right.
Kind of. Yeah, right. For alcohol, it ain't bad. Hey, tequila's pretty healthy too. Look at the last results.
There
All
you
right,
go.
guys. Cheers. All right. So, first question to get us started before we go to Alex Kekoa, very quickly, one or two sentences. How would you summarize what you know, what you don't know, or what you think you know about Miyamoto Musashi?
I know Miyamoto Musashi wrote the Book of Five Rings, and it's a book that we've kind of been studying. He also studied the way and the strategy of how to be I guess, an overall great martial artist. What I don't know is I wouldn't even know what I don't know. Don't know what I
Well,
don't know. Yeah.
the more you think you know, the less you do. So, Alex, we got so far. A guy's written the Book of Five Rings. I'm going to share my screen for a second. Along with that, like you said, a martial artist a lot of people know of. And for some reason, he looks like the member of the Japanese boy band SMAP. Is that right? How accurate is this?
uh, that was a relatively recent program, wasn't it? That would have been about 2013.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure Musashi did not look like that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, no.
So this is where we're starting with what we have on Miyamoto Musashi. Um, I want to start mostly talking about his duels. We can talk about his beginning and his books, but a lot of people who get the history, they start with the duels. How many duels did this guy have?
Well, according to what Musashi said himself in the foreword uh, to the book that he wrote, the Book of Five Rings, he reckons that throughout his career, he had something like 60 duels, um, which, well, in those days were often duels to the death, mortal combat, but not necessarily. But in any case, he lived to the ripe old age of 65, and uh, well, not quite that old perhaps, but he was in his final moments when he was in the cave of Regando down in Kyushu. He wrote that, he'd engaged in 60 duels and he'd won them all. But for the first half of his life, he wasn't sure if he won his duels because he was so goddamn good, or maybe his opponents weren't so good. But 60, which is
Now,
a fair
so,
number. Yeah.
and I was gonna ask, compared to other swordsmen around the time, how does that compare? Like, that's a lot more than usual, or pretty close?
That's a real tough question
Mhm.
because it really boils down to what is your definition of a duel, of
Mhm.
course, and this is a very open question. Um, there was a time where Musashi's prowess was actually questioned, especially interestingly during the 1930s when Yoshikawa Eiji sort of sparked another Musashi boom with his what was to become a novel, but it started off as a series of, well, I guess they were almost daily stories in the newspaper, in the Asahi newspaper. But around about this time, it was kind of there was two lines of thought about Musashi and his dueling prowess, and one line of thought suggested that he wasn't that good because there are very few records of the people that he actually did fight,
Hmm.
which means that they could have been any kind of lowly scumbag that might not necessarily have been a particularly strong swordsman to face off against. So the quality of his opponents is very, well, let's just say, uh, could be held with a little bit of suspicion. We don't know. And that can be said for many other, martial artists, swordsmen of the time.
Mhm.
Um, the ones particularly famous duels, of course, have been recorded for posterity, but many of these other fights, even if he says he's been through 60 fights, that could very well just be an approximation,
Hmm.
actually. I had about 60 fights in my life, It's like, well,
Yeah.
okay. Um, can you verify that? Well, we just don't know. It's a very gray area. So, another thing to keep in mind is around about that time, Japan was just trying to stabilize. It just come out of, a very turbulent time, known widely as the Warring States period. Finally, thanks to Oda Nobunaga, then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan was kind of unified. Um, and this is exactly the time that Musashi lived. And even though Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate, which, after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, the shogunate was created in 1603. And then, this new governance created by Tokugawa Ieyasu ushered Japan into an era that was referred to as Tenka Taihei, or the peaceful realm.
Mhm.
Um, but at the time, this in the early days of the Tokugawa period, it was still very unstable. And you still had a lot of allies of the now dead Hideyoshi and Osaka, and there were these kind of sort of factions, which way was Japan going to go? Obviously, Tokugawa had the upper hand, but not everybody was a fan of the Tokugawas.
Mhm.
And So it was kind of in those particular days there was there's a lot of murders, a lot of violence, a lot of ronin
Hmm.
wandering the countryside looking for trouble. And so in that particular time there were probably a lot of very let's just say duels that perhaps didn't particularly follow any rigid rules of engagement.
Okay.
But afterwards, the Tokugawa government started getting very strict about the use of violence,
And
obviously
this
because they
was when
wanted.
was this around? Like around Musashi when he was already wandering around, or that before that? That they started getting
No,
strict.
during that and after that. So
Got
in
it.
the latter part of Musashi's career, obviously you couldn't have all these guys wandering around getting into fights everywhere. It was just it was going to cause all sorts of problem, and you get all sorts of vendettas, perhaps escalating into something a little bit more widespread. And just to maintain the peace in society required a major effort by the government. So inter school dueling was prohibited, and I can't for the life of me remember offhand when the government issued this decree that said no more fellows, but it was round about the time of Musashi that this was starting to happen. So it was a very transitional period in Japanese
Hmm.
history. So
It
to go back
really
to your
reminds me of
question,
oh, well, I was gonna say it reminds me. There's a couple things that reminds me so far that
yeah,
the way you talk about Musashi, how good is he? We're not sure. It sounds very similar to what people said about Bruce Lee. The people who trained with him say he was amazing, but a lot of people
yeah.
say, well, he's got nothing on record. There's one fight at a tournament, and they say the same thing. He wasn't really good for because we have no proof. But anyway, you were saying, as back to the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so how did it compare with other warriors? I go back to what I said right at the start. It really depends on your definition of what a duel is.
Okay.
Um, but it was at one stage it was very common actually because getting out into the wilderness, going and challenging local warriors who might have a name for themselves and defeating them. As I said, not necessarily in a life or death challenge, but in some kind of agreed upon format is
Hmm.
one way that you can stick some stuff in your CV when you're looking for a job.
Hmm.
Um, because if you've got a reputation for being somebody who knows how to fight, um, you're going to be a useful hire for some daimyo,
Hmm.
some warlord. So this was, well, the term that you often hear is musha shugyo.
Hmm.
So the swordsman, wandering swordsman, not necessarily with swords either. Some of them had spears and other weapons and so on, but they'd go around looking for challenges simply so that they could increase their cachet and get a bit more of a reputation so that maybe they can get some gainful employment. So at one stage, this was very common, but it really depended on the era that you're talking about. And
Hmm.
as I said, as the Tokugawa regime started to assert itself, these kind of opportunities or this kind of culture was very much quashed.
Hmm.
So Musashi was in the midst of that and towards the end of it.
I see. Now, Kekoa, I'm thinking this sounds a lot like the Dojo Yaburi we were looking at about we were talking about the Sergeant of Arms. Alex, we came across this term Dojo Yaburi. We were doing some history research now, like if you know Count Dante, you're familiar with him? Yeah, so like
Yeah.
during that time they had like the dojo wars happening in the 1970s, 80s, whatever.
Mhm.
Is this connected to the Dojo Yaburi? Is this something different or similar?
Well, dojo yaburi, dojos actually didn't really form themselves until a little bit later,
Hmm.
actually.
Oh, interesting.
In dojos that like what I'm sitting at in the moment type dojo. There, there weren't actually that many of them around.
Mhm.
So to go to a dojo and then challenge everybody and take that, the signboard away with you as a trophy of your exploits. This is, you often see it in popular culture. This wasn't actually as common as you think. But having
Okay.
said that, I mean, even Musashi, and I'm sure this is going to come up with his very famous uh, duel with, let's just say, for example, the Yoshioka. None of that took place in a dojo as such. So this whole
Okay.
idea of dojo yaburi is a little bit of a misnomer. Not
Interesting.
to say that it didn't happen, of course, in certain
Right.
cases it did, but perhaps
Interesting.
not as prevalent as what many people think.
Okay. Now, I want to ask quickly about. Here you go. You good? Your question? All right.
Yeah, I actually have some questions in regards to. I know that when he wrote this book, the Book of Five Rings, he was in his early 60s, and he was talking about all these duels and stuff that he had. But I was curious if there was a record of like when he started his dueling. Like, was he about maybe 15 or something like that? And
Well,
when his last
again,
duel?
yeah, I mean, he actually states in Gorin no Sho, in the Book of Five Rings, that the first experience he had in dueling, in mortal combat, was when he was
Mm,
13 years old. And that was against a warrior by the name of Arima Kihei. And again, we don't really know who Arima Kihei is. He's one of these obscure sort of footnotes in history. What we do know is that he was probably a warrior, a swordsman of the Shintoryu school, the Shintoryu created by Tsukahara Bokuden. But that's about all we know. And I guess with a little bit of educated guessing and some documentation that was written way after Musashi died, like about 100 years later, like in the Nitenki and various other kind of books that do exist that outline the life of Musashi second, third hand. We tend to believe those books because they're old, but actually they were written a lot long after Musashi died, so it's very debatable how reliable they are. But according to some of these documents, um, Arima Kihei visited Musashi's where he was living, his village, and stuck up a signpost saying, I'm here to challenge any swordsman who dares come to face me. And again, it's related to what we are talking about before with the Musha Shugyo, by going around and creating a name for yourself. You you I wouldn't say you're a celebrity as such, but you gain a name. You're more employable, more desirable, as it were. And so this Arima Kihei apparently went to Musashi's village. Musashi grabbed a big stick and said he'd take him on, smacked him in the head, knocked him on his face, and then beat him to death, apparently. And that was at the tender age of 13. So he may or may not have had pubes on his dick. I'm not sure about that, but that's where it was.
Now, I got a question on this guy as well, with Arima. In Kajukenbo, there's often a common discussion about legitimacy and rank. This guy has a black belt, does he know how to fight, et cetera, et cetera. A
Yeah.
lot of people kind of ride the coattails of their rank. Your professional opinion, of course, we don't know for sure. You got a 13-year-old Musashi kill a grown swordsman.
Mm.
Uh, your professional opinion, what we know, how much of that do you think was Musashi being a prodigy, a natural killer? How much of that was Arima maybe just kind of riding the coattails of I come from this school and therefore I have skill and most people don't?
or he was
Well,
drunk.
again, it's all conjecture, isn't it? As far
Of
as
course, of
Arima's
course.
concerned, the fact that he would go somewhere, if this is what happened, the fact that he would go somewhere and challenge locals means that, you're either very confident or you're very bloody stupid. Um, and so obviously he was I would say he was confident.
Mhm, mhm.
He had a fair amount of training, but okay, so what does that say about Musashi? What does that say about fighting in general? I mean, you could have all the training in the world and somebody just needs to pop you once and that's it, right? It could be a lucky strike.
Right.
But, the general consensus with regards to Musashi was that even as a young man, he'd undergone a considerable amount of training himself anyway, under the tutelage of his father, Munisai. And Munisai was also a fairly, well, I mean, he wasn't famous, not like his son became, but he was considered to be quite a formidable martial artist himself. And so the training that Musashi would have received under him would have been, well, would have been pretty tough. It
Mhm,
would have been pretty comprehensive. So it's not to say that Musashi was just an untrained youth. He had gone through a lot of training already by that stage.
mhm.
And the other general idea of Musashi, which is hard to confirm one way or the other, but you can imagine it's true if a 13-year-old did take out a fully grown swordsman like Arima Kihei, whether he was skilled or not, was that Musashi was a relatively strong, very violent natured kid. Um, so perhaps the way that, and the fact that he didn't use a sword, the story goes that in fact he used a big stick to
Hmm.
do the damage. So
And it
his
worked.
way of fighting, his way of thinking was, I think it's fair to say, fairly unconventional. And so
Hmm.
maybe that worked in his favor. And then when it comes down to it, when it's that one-on-one, it just
Hmm.
takes one blow and then,
Hmm.
you know, pretty much you tip the scales in your favor or they get tipped against you one way or the other, right? So there's a bit of
Especially with
probably
weapons,
a bit of
yeah.
luck in there as well.
Yeah, a little bit more on that. You said that he used a stick to fight off this guy. Now, did that the other swordsman use an actual sword against that stick?
Well, assuming so, but unfortunately nobody had smartphones back then to take photos of what was going on. We can only rely on, as I mentioned,
Mhm.
documents that were written well after Musashi's death.
Mhm.
Like, we're talking about 100 years later. So how much you can trust that we don't know. So you have to sort of try and use your imagination a little bit. But I would assume that Arimakihe, being a swordsman from the Shintoryu, would have um, taken his kamae with his preferred weapon, which would have been a sword.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but that's not to say that swordsmen in those days, a lot of them didn't use spears as well. But in Musashi's case, at least with the record that does exist, it said that he used a big stick. Not only that, actually, quite interestingly, um, I think it was his body that was the main weapon. He just apparently picked up Arimakihe and smashed him on his head. That
Ouch.
would be
Jesus.
kind of like,
Pro
pro
wrestling coming out of
wrestling.
nowhere.
Yeah.
So Musashi got kind of big. I heard he was not a small guy, according to what we know. Is that kind of hinted at?
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
okay.
again, nobody knows for sure, but you
Right, right.
estimate around about 180 centimeters. So what's that, 6 foot?
Okay.
Okay, thereabouts,
Hmm.
which today is not big by anybody's standards. It's well, it is by mine because I'm only 5'8", but 6 foot. That's I'm in New Zealand at the moment. You just walk down the street and everybody's 6 foot. But you've got to remember in those days, the average height for a Japanese man, a fully grown Japanese man, was, again from memory, I think it was about 156 centimeters. Um, so I don't know what that is in feet and inches,
But much shorter.
but not much over 5 foot, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So comparatively speaking, he was a big boy for sure.
Okay. Now, this was his first duel. He, at some point, we'll talk later. Musashi leaves. He kind of starts wandering. I want to ask about, I think it was his third duel, and you mentioned the guy, Yoshioka Seijiro. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so can you tell us about what happened there and how did that go?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, I'm just in the process, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, of retranslating Yoshikawa Eiji's novel, Miyamoto Musashi. And one of the big highlights, obviously, of that novel is the relationship that Musashi had with the House of Yoshioka. Now, Yoshioka was a school of swordsmanship based in Kyoto, and the father, um, uh, Seijiro's father, was a fellow by the name of Yoshioka Kempo. Uh, not nothing to do with this kind of Kempo or anything like that, but his name was Kempo. And he was a very skilled martial artist, and to the extent that he was actually one of the instructors to the Muromachi shogunate, to the shoguns. So he had a lot of cachet in Kyoto, and because of that, he had a lot of students studying at the Yoshioka school. And so, in the novel about Miyamoto Musashi, it talks about, well, Musashi, he makes his way to Kyoto, and he wants to prove himself as not just a country bumpkin that's good at flailing sticks. He wanted to show that he had what it takes, and he went, according to the story, he went to the Yoshioka dojo, which, according to Yoshikawa Eiji, was in Shijo in Kyoto, and he challenged. Uh, well, he actually wanted to challenge Seijiro first, but he wasn't there at the time, and so some of the students decided to have a crack at him and instead, send him packing, with his tail between his legs, this insolent country bumpkin that just turns up to the dojo and thinks that the master's going to entertain him, right? But in the story, he ends up pretty much smashing the hell out of some of the top disciples, which sent ripples, shockwaves. And so eventually, the showdown was set with the headmaster of the school, which was Yoshioka Kempo's son, because Kempo's now dead. And so it came to be. They had a duel, and Musashi pretty much thrashed him. I must emphasize this is the story, okay, as written in various documents long after Musashi died,
Hmm.
that have been taken at face value and weaved into modern renditions of Musashi's life,
Right.
uh, which we will see on TV or in movies about Miyamoto Musashi, radio shows, comics like Vagabond, and so on and so forth. A lot of what we know about Musashi, no, let me rephrase that. A lot of what we think we know about Musashi is very much based on fiction.
Hmm.
And so, it's commonly thought that, that's how the thing with the Yoshiokas started. How it really started, well, it's probably not as grand as that. But for sure, when he was in Kyoto, which was really the center, it was the capital of Japan, right? Who do you want to go and test your metal against? Well, obviously, the most famous school in the land, which it wasn't, but in the area it was. And so he surely would have challenged the leader of the Yoshioka school at the time.
Hmm.
Uh, if he lost, well, he may have received a beating, perhaps a fatal beating. But if he won, then suddenly his stocks go through the roof, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so it's a bit of a gamble. But
Hmm.
that's exactly what Musha Shugyo was all about.
Hmm.
There comes a point where you have to gamble everything. It's all or nothing, really. And
Right.
so
Right.
it was very much Musashi was clearly confident enough that he could go to the Yoshioka school and challenge, which is what he
Okay.
did. So that is true.
Hmm.
That absolutely happened, but perhaps it didn't happen the way that most people think it did. I don't think it was, you know, uh, a massively grand affair to start with, but it certainly was the first thing.
Hmm.
I guess you could say Musashi's career-making move
Hmm.
was to take on the Yoshiokas in Kyoto and prevail. And it's on the basis of that, in his victory against Yoshioka, that he created his first school.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and the name of the school was the Emmei-ryu. So everybody thinks of Musashi as Niteichi-ryu and stuff, but before that, he actually created he actually, when he was, I think he was about 21 years old.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
He created the Emmei-ryu, and that was on the basis of his victory over the Yoshioka.
Huh.
And so this was really big for his career. It really was a massive home run.
Okay, now, as Alex, you were talking about that, of course, a lot of this is fictional. It's changed over time. We've got some of our own Kajukenbo history that things that we thought were true, we're finding out, oh, actually, that was changed or exaggerated, et cetera, et cetera. Based on what we know, or based on the fictional story, I want to ask Kekoa a true false question. This is a pop quiz. Alex, you can help me out, even if it's from the fiction. Kekoa,
Yes.
so Musashi just killed this guy, Yoshioka Seijuro. According to the stories, true or false, Musashi is now done with the Yoshioka clan.
I would say false. He's probably got a lot of vendettas to clear through.
Alex, what's the answer? According to the stories.
Well, according to the stories and according to the truth, that was just the beginning.
Hmm.
He had a number of duels against the Yoshioka, actually. Actually, it's kind of interesting. This is something that not many people know, but I mentioned before that Miyamoto Musashi's father, Munisai, he also challenged the Yoshiokas. Yeah, right. Not many people know that. Um, and actually, Munisai had also defeated the Yoshiokas before in a duel.
Uh,
Um, and so I guess that's why Musashi, in a way, was following in his father's footsteps. But he, 2 years after he arrived in Kyoto, he challenged the same Yoshioka family that Munisai had bested a few years before. And it was, from memory, it was 1604 is when he defeated Seijuro, who was as we've already established, he was the headmaster now after his father. And then, of course, after he defeated Seijuro, the second encounter was against Seijuro's younger brother, whose name was Denshichiro. And according to Yoshikawa Eiji's book, I don't know if this is true or not, to be honest, but according to Yoshikawa Eiji's book, Denshichiro was actually more skilled than his older brother. He just liked to drink a lot. And so he wasn't really entrusted the dojo
okay.
yeah, until Seijiro gone. But Denshichiro was also defeated.
Mhm.
And then finally, it came down to the most dastardly duel of them all. It was against Seijuro's son, and his son's name was Matashichiro. Okay, and this is the really famous of all of the duels. This is the really famous one because Matashichiro was apparently very young, like just a young teenager. Um, and that is reflected in the novel about Miyamoto Musashi. But in this particular instance, and this is where it gets a little bit hazy, because Mata Shichiro was so young, he was accompanied by many followers of the Yoshioka school, the Yoshioka Ryu. And this is where the legend really starts to grow, because in this particular case, it turns out that it wasn't a one-on-one match, it was a 1 on 100, or so they say.
Mhm.
Okay, but certainly Musashi had to deal with more than one opponent in this case, whether it was 100 or whether it was 10.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, it was not 100, but if
Right,
you
right.
read the novel, it's about that much. But even 10, but using his strategy and so forth. But it was because of this he defeated 3 generations of headmasters of the Yoshoka school, and this was when Musashi declared himself Tenkaichi, which means champion of the realm. Um, so I guess this was like he felt like he didn't have to dwell in his father's shadow anymore. He was tested now, and he was triumphant. Uh, so he was confident enough at this point to start his own school,
Hmm.
which I mentioned before. The name of the school was Enmeryu, and I've been thinking a bit of decent translation for Enmer. En is the kanji for well Japanese yen, but it
Okay,
also
all right.
means circle.
Mm.
and me means light. So I sort of think of it as kind of like the circle of light, which is a kind of a reference to enlightenment, actually.
Mm.
If you look in Buddhist teachings, the circle in Zen, for example, that's the kind of image that I have of it. And on the basis of creating his own school, he also wrote his first book. And the name of the book is Heidokyo. So everybody knows of the Book of Five Rings, Gorin no Sho, but very few people know about Heidokyo, which was written in 1605. And this he wrote this to record uh, his various techniques and the rationale behind them. And I've actually translated that, which is in my Tuttle book of translation of the Book of Five Rings. If anybody's interested, it's very difficult to. God, it was difficult to
Okay.
translate uh,
It's hard to
because
read sometimes. Jeez.
yeah, it was pretty tough. But I think a lot of the techniques that he talks about, and this is, he's only very young at this stage, just in his early 20s. A lot of the techniques, I think, were very much influenced by his father, Munisai. Um, and Munisai had his own school as well, which he called Toriryu. So people often think of Musashi as this lone wolf, but he had a lot of influence from his father, I think.
Hmm. I want
And
to ask you about that
so,
lone wolf thing later. Yeah. But
oh
anyway,
God,
please
here we go.
continue. Yeah, please continue. No, that's
Yeah,
another thing that gets changed the fiction and all that and the imagery. But anyway, please continue.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, with regards to his last fight against Mata Shichiro, um, there is a monument about Miyamoto Musashi in a place called Kokura, which is northern Kyushu. Um, and on that monument, the inscription on the monument was actually written by Miyamoto Musashi's adopted son, Iori.
Hmm.
So, in terms of the veracity of this particular document, um, it's prone to exaggeration, but it was written by somebody who knew Musashi directly. It was his son, for crying out loud, right?
Right,
And
right.
on that monument, it says Iori wrote that the Yoshioka disciples conspired to ambush Musashi with several hundred men.
Several hundred.
Okay, and this is where the problem. So, of course, anybody who reads this is going to say, "Well, shit, Iori wrote it, so it must be true." And then suddenly, what transpired at the drooping pine tree, which is uh, the Sagarimatsu tree in Ichijoji in Kyoto. This is where that duel took place, apparently. It sort of got elevated to legendary status where Musashi took on 100 people at once. And that's what gave birth to the legend, okay?
Mhm.
Uh, famous slash infamous Miyamoto Musashi, uh, the great slaughterer of young kids like Mata Shichiro and anybody else who came at him. And
Right.
this is what gave rise to the Musashi industry, Musashi pop culture. It's not just something that happens now.
Mhm.
It started hundreds of years ago, not long after Musashi died in 1645. Suddenly the legend grew. And it's thanks to these kind of rather exaggerated documents that exist that this just took on a life of its own, which is why we are talking about it today.
Right.
If it
Right.
wasn't for this, nobody would know about Musashi. He's
Right.
just it's just quite
Well, and
remarkable. The story
well,
has fueled imagination.
and again, going back to mention Bruce Lee earlier, again, this is like the same exact story we hear about Bruce Lee, that we have people who think he was a god and other people saying that we have no proof any of this happened, but it still inspired people,
Mm.
regardless of what it actually was. So if you guys are ready, we're going to take our next shot. We're actually moving around with our ideas. I still find it funny. In Japanese, mata sometimes means again. So the son was named again Shichiro, Mata Shichiro.
Mata Shichiro. Cheers, boys.
Cheers, brother. So
Mm.
I wanted to talk a bit about his past, but we've already been talking about his father, a little bit of Musha Shugyo. If it's okay, I want to jump ahead to talk one more duel because I feel like this might be more popular for some people, and that's Sasaki Kojiro.
Ah,
This like the climax of the Eiji Yoshikawa book, and I
mm,
know that's not where his story ends, but that's where the book ends.
yep.
Uh, and again, there's a fiction, there's a real. What do we know about this case?
Well, wow. Yeah,
We do another
to
podcast on this one alone, or
yeah, you probably could. It's a really interesting story. But yeah, you're right. People know about the duel with Sasaki Kojiro as almost the climax of Musashi's career, but it was really the turning point if you look at it realistically. And there's so much to this. Like, there's so much fiction to it, and real motivations for the duel. Again, it's conjecture, but it's really interesting when you get to the nub of it. But in any case, as we talked about before, like Musashi claimed to have engaged in over 60 duels, um, which I think it's fair to say was quite a large number for his time, even though we don't know what kind of people he fought. So that's just kind of what we
right.
talked about before. But of those 60 duels, the most celebrated by far um, was this match against what people, the fellow people know as Sasaki Kojiro. But Sasaki wasn't his real name, actually. That was something that was made up about 100 years later in some popular kabuki show. So his real
Oh,
name
really?
was
Wow.
Ganryu Kojiro was his real name.
Oh,
The duel itself took place in 1610. Now, if you look at most books about it, they'll say 1612, but this is actually incorrect. It was 1610. And it took place on an island called Funajima. And
Ship
this
Island.
island, yeah, the name of the island has changed now. They changed it to Gandu-jima, which is way down the between. It's in the strait between Kyushu and Honshu. Now, the details of this famous duel have long been debated, um, but that monument that I mentioned in Kokura that was written by Iori, what it says on that is probably the closest to the truth. So what happened was the men met at the designated time. Musashi used his massive wooden sword against Kojiro's massive blade,
So
and
wooden sword again
Musashi,
this time.
yeah, yeah, and Musashi basically, according to the story, killed Kojiro with one decisive blow, and that was the end of the story. Now, who was Kojiro? So this is kind of important. Kojiro was a martial arts instructor for the Hosokawa clan in Kumamoto, the House of Hosokawa. And he was known as a formidable swordsman. He was known as the demon of the West. So that means West Japan.
Right.
And his reputation was very well established. The fact that he was teaching swordsmanship for the Hosokawa daimyo just shows that he was a step above the rest. He was the cream of the cream. Um, Now, according to a document, now what was it called? Numata Kaki, I think it was. It was written in 1672, so it's not long after Musashi died. He died in 1645, so comparatively speaking, it was relatively recent. According to this document, Musashi registered his intent to challenge Kojiro with a counselor, an elder of the Hosokawa clan, by a guy by the name of Nagaoka Sado no Kami Okinaga, and he's one of the characters in the novel, actually.
Mhm.
Um, Apparently, Nagaoka received permission from the duel to go ahead from the Hosokawa Lord. Now, this is kind of complicated, but it's really interesting. And what's complicated is Kojiro occupied a very important position in the Hosokawa domain as its teacher of swordsmanship. So it's kind of surprising that he even agreed to a challenge from Miyamoto Musashi.
Is that because of a risk, or is that because of some other reason?
Risk is one. Two is like obviously he doesn't need to,
Mhm.
because He's already in a position. Why would he risk anymore? He doesn't need to prove anything anymore. He stood
Right.
to lose everything if
Hmm.
he was defeated, right?
Mm.
Um, Moreover, if he was actually killed by Musashi, there was the distinct possibility that his students would go crazy and try and seek revenge, and that
Yeah.
would disturb the peace, and all hell would pay, and the Bakufu would get pissed off, and it'd be a real mess. Um, so it would have been a way of attracting unwanted attention from the central government. So this was kind of weird that this thing went ahead. But in spite of all this, the duel was sanctioned. Okay.
Interesting.
But it was sanctioned under a very strict caveat. And that was that the duel was to take place on this very small contained island called Funajima.
Oh, that was
And
part of the agreement. Okay.
yes, as per agreement. And the only people allowed there were the officially appointed witnesses of the duel.
Hmm.
So it wasn't a free for all that everybody can go and check out, and I'm sure they wanted to. Anyway, what's really interesting here is why did Musashi challenge Kojiro in the first place?
Hmm.
So, according to the you know, popular
Story.
cultural version, like in Yoshikawa Eiji, and what most people think is true, they think it's some kind of vendetta
Hmm.
or some kind of rivalry that had been simmering for many years and finally came to a head. Um, but it was nothing like that, actually. It was kind of really interesting. If you piece together all of the documents that sort of cover it, and there's lots of rubbish out there that were written, about 100 years after it happened, and it's like because that's old, you think it must be true. But it was
Right.
a very divisive. It was a very divisive thing that happened, and what they think, or what scholars think now, is that now this is where it's really bizarre. Musashi's father, Munisai, was also in some way associated with the Hosokawa clan, right?
Hmm.
And he also taught swordsmanship to the Hosokawa samurai, to the Kumamoto samurai. And among his students was this Nagaoka Sado no Kami, Okinaga fellow. And this is probably true. And so this could mean that Musashi's father was behind the duel.
Eh.
So we've got to do a bit of guesswork here, but basically, Munisei was probably teaching a very strange style of swordsmanship using two swords. So everybody thinks that Musashi's the one that invented that, right?
Right. I was going to ask you about that later. Yeah.
Musashi certainly refined it. He took it. He did stuff with it. But again, we see his father's incredible influence here. I think
Yeah.
Munisai was really sort of the main influence behind Musashi taking this, right?
Hmm.
And so this could mean that Munisai was probably teaching his dual sword techniques of his school, the Toriryu, to the Hosokawa men. So within a domain, like in this case, the Hosokawa domain, it's not just one martial art or one sword master that's employed. You usually have a few different martial
Hmm.
arts and different masters. In this case, um, Ganryu Kojiro, or Sasaki Kojiro, as he's known now, and Musashi's father were probably teaching samurai of the
Huh.
Hosokawa domain at the same time.
Hmm.
And probably there was a bit of rivalry there between the students of each one, even though they're samurai of the same domain. And so
Wow. I
probably
never heard
this
this.
rivalry it's like, you know, what Muniso was teaching was probably weird. And I'm just using my imagination here, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking that Gundu students are saying, what the hell are those mugs over there doing? What sort of crap is that? we call ladder martial art. What
Yeah.
a bunch of
This
whiskey.
sounds very familiar, doesn't it, Kekoa?
Exactly, exactly. And so probably you got this rather awkward situation within the domain. And when this was going on, Musashi was doing his little traipsing around the country, sort of doing his visiting professorship sort of thing. And he was probably down in Kyushu, and he was probably going to go and visit his father and, say hello and all the rest of it. Um, but this rivalry was simmering out of control,
Hmm.
right? And there was a lot of open slander and overly zealous students with, you're really getting disrupting the harmony within this one domain. And so, with this really tense atmosphere, which had to be controlled some way, the Hosokawa authorities may have thought it best to diffuse the situation by having a duel to
Let him
decide
fight it
when they
out.
win. But not with Munisai versus Kojiro, but it just so happened that Musashi was in the area. Let's get him to do it instead. And so you get that deciding duel, but at the end of the day,
Hmm.
it's not both of your swordsmanship instructors. And
Hmm.
so probably Kojiro was coerced into it, perhaps. Musashi was also just used as perhaps a point of convenience more than
Almost a
anything.
pawn.
Yeah, and so in the end, okay, it came down to Musashi stepping in for his father and Kojiro, and we all know how it ended. Okay, Kojiro was defeated by Musashi, and that's what
Right.
it was. But in the novel, in the popular culture, versions, of course, it's much more tense, much more emotional than this. It's like, it's been
Yeah,
building
yeah.
as the climax, and finally when it happens, that's it. But it was just one of the little things that happened in Musashi's life. It certainly wasn't a highlight, but certainly is what people remember him for mainly now because of the popular culture.
Yeah, it gets exciting. And the way you mentioned about the different schools, like, what the hell are they doing over there? That's not martial arts. That rings a bell in some ways. Kiko, what are you
Oh
thinking?
yeah, yeah, yeah. We
That
don't
that
we
makes a
don't.
lot of sense too, because you're thinking, number one, if both swordsmen who were teaching both fought each other, there was a risk that they were using real swords would kill each other at the same time. So then you'd lose both teachers, right? So when they had Musashi step in, he had to use a wooden sword against him, correct? That means that he wouldn't have been able to actually kill this guy, but if he died, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal because his father was still the teacher. So
How'd that play out, Alex?
really tracks.
Well, see, this is kind of that's also debatable. That often in this, I just sort of just reminded me of something I should add. The common story is Musashi turned up late on purpose to irritate his opponent, so he had that psychological advantage, and
Jumbo.
and he was on the boat rowing out there. He got somebody to row him out. Meanwhile, he picked up an oar and he carved it into a weapon. Musashi, he's known for two swords, but actually whether he ever used two swords in combat, that's also debatable.
Hmm.
Um, the theory was he says so quite clearly in Gordon no Shore. He trains with two swords so that he can use any weapon at any time with either hand.
Right.
Okay, not necessarily to use the two swords as
Oh,
his main mode of fighting, right? It's training for him, training the left
interesting.
and
Yeah,
yeah.
both the long swords.
And so not
Yeah,
only
yeah, yeah.
his use of whopping great big sticks was actually, you know, quite well known. And uh, you go up against somebody with a sword or somebody with a big stick, which would you prefer? Well, either or, they're pretty nasty. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, but you imagine a big 6 foot guy in those days with a whopping great big stick. Those a bokuto hurts, man. It might not cut your head open, but it will smash it open. Okay,
Yeah.
Right.
so either way, the result is going to be the same. So the use of the wooden sword is not necessarily an indication of pacifistic tendencies, put it that way.
Hmm.
If you wanted to use that to deadly effect, it's not that, it's not much different to a sword. Um, just doesn't cut, it koshes
It
instead.
hurts. It's
Yeah, it
also interesting when
hurts.
you mentioned how it's training with both hands. We have this cross block we do, and I always tell my students I hate this block because I don't like the idea of tying up your hands, instead of doing something else. But that's what I've always started to view it as, is this is training with using your hands at once, not necessarily blocking both at the same time, but you're still training something different than what's actually
Yeah,
happening. So I find
I
that
like
kind of
it. I think it's really underrated because you can block a straight punch, block this way, and then you can turn out this way or turn out this way. So it just opens up options immediately.
right, exactly. The idea that you have one thing, but you have another technique is what your goal is. I find that interesting that Musashi was supposedly doing this with two swords. That's the idea of that. A lot of the thinking process also reminds me of the eskrima we do because
Mhm.
a lot of people talk about the stick. Some people will tell you that that is much better than a knife. Of course, they both got advantages, but you got much more reach with the stick, and it's gonna hurt like hell when you hit the hand or pop them in the head. And it's kind of hard to stab somebody when you're walking around drunk from getting hit in the head.
And the other thing with the stick is you can always use the other end and then switch it up, and there's total deception right there.
Right, whole
You're
other side
thinking
of
I'm
that.
coming back over the top, and all of a sudden I'm coming down low.
Well, how about you, Alex? Did you ever try the two sword style?
yes, I did. Um,
How'd it
for a
go?
very simple, practical reason. Kendo is usually done with one stick, of course. A very small percentage of people do nito. You can do it with the short sword in the right hand or the short sword in the left hand and the long sword
Mhm.
held up. And I did it a couple of years ago because I came down with this rather inconvenient affliction called adhesive capsulitis. Do you know what adhesive capsulitis is?
No
Frozen
clue.
shoulder. Frozen shoulder.
Oh,
Yeah.
I've had that.
So
Yeah.
I
They,
couldn't
don't they call
even.
that yeah.
Yeah, in
Don't they call it
Japan.
yonjugata?
Yeah, yeah. Or in my case, it was goju kata. Okay. Um, because
50-year-old
I'm in my
shoulder.
50s. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it hurts like hell, and you can't lift your arm up. So I couldn't actually do kendo. So
Ah,
I
okay.
cottoned on pretty quickly that if I did nito, I could just hold the
Hmm.
short sword down here. I wouldn't have to lift this up.
Oh, that's cool.
And I'm fighting like
That-
that. So
That's cool.
that was my. I've done the kata of Niteichi Ryu, not extensively, but
Hmm.
I have had very intensive private lessons in that, um, which I'm very grateful for. Somebody thought
Uh-huh.
if I'm studying Musashi, I should study the sword forms
Hmm.
as well, which is fair enough. But in terms of actual fighting, that was
Hmm.
yeah, it was 1 year until my arms,
Shoulder
my
came back.
shoulders. Yeah,
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 like when I broke my toe, it's my big toe, but that means I couldn't throw, a regular old punch the way I wanted to throw it. So
right.
started training cane stick, cane fighting, using a cane when you're walking and swinging that instead. The idea that you can train this stuff, maybe it's not going to be what you're actually going to throw, but if you are injured, you can still do something, exercise training, and maybe
Yeah,
even defend yourself if that's all you got.
yeah. I mean, that was what Musashi's always about. It's like the last thing you want to do is prefer one thing. What you need to
Right,
do is to be able to train to use anything at any time. Because the best laid plans of men and mice, as we all know.
right,
So that was really the crux of his martial philosophy. Was he
That's his
wasn't really
style.
bogged down in all these little details about doing this and the other thing. It's like shit, you've got a cider bottle. How do you use it?
yeah.
Um,
Oh,
He
if
also
you
mentioned
if you've got two swords, try using two swords. It'd be a real shame if you ended up getting killed, not using all of the resources available to you. But in
right,
terms of the Nito or using two swords, it really was. He says it clearly. It's like it's strength training. It's also to get your uh, uh, I'm trying to think of the right word. Donkusai in English. What in Japanese? In English, I should say.
don't.
What is that?
That's the negative thing,
Coordination.
isn't it?
Okay,
Oh,
so
okay, okay.
yeah, it is a negative. If you're donkusai, you're uncoordinated, right? So
Right,
it's to
okay,
get
okay,
your,
okay, yeah,
to
yeah.
be able your left hand or your right hand or whatever it is you got without any particular favoritism.
Right.
So that was the whole thing. So whether he actually used Nito in combat, which everybody thinks he did, but actually there's nothing that says that he did.
No proof of
Not that
that.
I can find it. Mm, yeah.
I was gonna say, going back to what he was talking about was learning all the other weapons. It wasn't just to be able to pick up another weapon and use it, but when your opponent was using another weapon, then you would understand the limitations of that weapon and what it could do to you. So then when you were using another weapon against it, you have a better idea how to defend and attack.
Yep. That was a standard kind of way of thinking behind any school in those days. It's like that, a particular school might specialize in one weapon, but they would have kata against all these other different weapons, which you
Uh,
have to learn.
Yeah.
So that you can work out the strengths and weaknesses of each. But even with
hmm.
that, Musashi was very much he criticized schools that focused on, long swords only or short swords only or this or
Hmm.
that only. He was very much into being able to wrangle anything to your own advantage, and that's not just the weapon, but also it goes to the core of his strategy about where you stand and the timing, the angle, which and using the environment to your advantage, but also using your opponent's stupidity to their disadvantage as well. So yeah,
A
that's
lot of
what he
those
was all about.
stories,
That's what got
yeah, a lot of those the fictional stories did a lot of that idea of Musashi showing up late or showing up really early to ambush somebody, whatever. There was a lot of that playing with their stupidity in mind or not. Real quick before we do our next shot, I want to ask, because we mentioned earlier how we had this image of Musashi as a vagabond, a lone wolf, and all the stuff about his dad I had not heard. There's another side of this though, is I understand he was in a couple battles. Was that true? That all the stories focus on the duels and him wandering, but apparently I heard somewhere that he was actually enlisted in some battles. Is that true?
yeah, yeah. So, for example, with the popular story by Yoshikawa Eiji that starts with the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, um, it was often contested that, well, he wasn't actually there, so that's rubbish. But turns out, according to relatively recent discoveries of documents, especially from the Kuroda house, Kuroda Josui was one of the pro Tokugawa daimyo. Turns out that Musashi's father and Musashi probably fought down in Kyushu at the time of Sekigahara. So he wasn't actually there, but he was a pro Tokugawa. In all of the popular culture, he's actually anti Tokugawa. He's on the Ishida side, but actually it turns out he was probably on the pro Tokugawa side when he was very young. And then after that, there weren't a hell of a lot of battles, but one that campaign that he was involved in was in Kyushu, the Shimabara Rebellion, and I think that was 1637. And so he did see actual combat apart from dueling. He was involved in the armies of daimyo, but not extensively because you've got to remember his time. He was also probably involved in the siege of Osaka Castle as well, which was to stamp out the last remnants of Hideyoshi's descendants. Um, so that was in 1615. So 1615, and probably his last battle was in 1637. So it wasn't exceedingly battle hardened in terms of the large scale battles, but he certainly experienced at least three campaigns
Mhm.
in his life. But apart from that, it was all the individual Musha Shugyo training that he was doing in between. That's where he got his name. Yeah.
Yeah,
So he
again, I
wasn't
find that interesting.
a yeah.
Yeah. I find it interesting because that's again it goes against the image of him just being this lone wolf. There's stories about him never taking baths and everything. He was so focused on not being killed and only defining his skill, but actually he was in the shadow of his father the whole time. He's got all this. He was actually joined these battles. That it's a very different image, those things, than
Yeah,
other people get.
yeah, indeed.
Well,
He
what's
was
that?
kind of an enigma. I think I don't know. I wonder if he wasn't a little bit on the spectrum, what we would say
Hmm.
now, being on the spectrum.
Autism spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, at least not perhaps even I don't know, extremely introverted.
Hmm.
Um, because he, I think there was a time in his life where he actually wanted to be employed, gainfully employed in some, uh, daimyo family or, sorry, as a retainer for some daimyo household. But it never happened for him. He was invited to go to places as what we would call now a visiting professor, a kind of a guest, but he was never actually really given the offer of a job to become a hereditary
Hmm.
retainer. And there's reasons for that. Perhaps his take on swordsmanship and combat was just too unorthodox.
Hmm.
And perhaps he uh, didn't quite gel with people well enough. He couldn't do the old gomasuri thing.
Flattery.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, the old flattery, and he might have been a little bit of a difficult person to get on with for various reasons. I really think he was, if anything, he was very introverted,
Hmm.
um, and so he clearly had his struggles. So in that sense, he kind of was a bit of a lone wolf, but I don't think he wanted to be a lone wolf as much
Hmm.
as what we
Interesting.
think he does in the portrayals that you get in the books and
Yeah.
and so forth.
All right. Let's continue on. We'll do our next shot and move on to our next thing very quickly. You guys are ready?
Oh, hang on a minute, mate. Hang on a minute. This is actually really good. Oh, cheers, boys.
Cheers, brother.
Oh
All right.
yeah.
So we're getting close to the end of our show. Um, I want to ask about Musashi's legacy, about what he can do, what he can offer martial artists today. Can his teachings help people in the modern day mindset? We got the Book of Five Rings and his writings and the stories, the fiction. People who do MMA, self-defense, or just interested in martial arts day-to-day life. Can his
Hmm.
teachings help these people?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes, of course. Um, and the reason why I say that is because, like, coming from the perspective of a kendo practitioner, many of the things that we are taught in kendo today are not just physical techniques, but the sort of rationale behind them. Things like timing, cadence. Um, they're the things we are taught in kendo actually have a direct connection to Miyamoto Musashi's teachings. And so many things that we are taught in the dojo today actually stem back to Musashi Gorin no Sho and the massive influence that that's had on kendo practitioners, especially in the modern era. Um, and there's a very good reason for this. Musashi's teachings from the very first book that he created, Heidokyo, in 1605, and then Gorin no Sho, 1645. What is really amazing about these books is they were written as textbooks. Now, in those days, schools, when they wrote, when a master would write a book of some sort of scroll, whatever, it's to ensure that the teachings of the school are passed on to the next generation, and can continue, but often they're very cryptic, and you have to have other pieces of the puzzle to be able to make sense of it, like the kuden, which is the oral teachings, and also putting it together with the various kata, and then everything sort of comes into place. And the reason for that, because they didn't want the secrets of the school being divulged to rival schools, because then the potency of those techniques and the teachings would diminish.
Right.
Whereas Musashi didn't give a damn about that. He wrote Gorin no Sho as a textbook. He put it down and very, yeah, he put these technique, all his teachings down in a very uncryptic fashion, actually. It's very matter of fact. And so his idea was, and basically is every teaching that he has in there, he will finish with something like, "You have to study this well," or "You have to just get your ass out there and train." That's
uh,
all there is to it. Just train your butt off, you know. And that was, he said, you could have all these wonderful, lofty theories and teachings, but if you don't get out there and train, it means nothing because you don't know shit.
Shut up
Okay,
and
and
train.
that was his attitude. So he didn't try and
Mhm.
hide anything. But what's interesting about them is that, the techniques he outlined, and he outlined the rationale behind them. Um, and he also looks at various uh, possible, well, things that you need to be aware of when you're training, when you're fighting, things to look at in your opponent. And sometimes, it's almost like the precursor to sports psychology in many
Mm.
ways. So if you actually read, many of the the sections and perhaps the techniques and the explanations of techniques that he puts uh, in Gorin no Sho, for example, some of it doesn't make any sense at all because we don't know well, you don't have the context for it. But if you have something to put that into context, be it in my case, my kendo, then a lot of it does make perfect sense and it's very valid
Mm.
and it's very useful strategy, very useful mindset to help you prevail in what you're doing, be it sport, be it kendo, be it what you guys do, be it whatever. So he wrote it specifically for that, something that is a practical guide so that you can get on with getting on. And
Hmm.
so I think a lot of his teachings are extremely relevant to anybody in any field. And in fact, um, I really, really don't know if I should say this, but I will.
Uh-oh. Go for it.
Yeah. Um, the CEO of Tuttle is
Yeah.
the major publisher, which I do a lot of work for. He was in Kyoto the other day, and so whenever he comes over, we go out for dinner. And he said this a year ago, and I said, yeah, 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 yeah. And what he said was, brother, if you want to make money, okay, you have to, all your historical stuff's really important, but people want to know how they can use this in their daily life, right? And he
Hmm.
says the only genre of books making any money these days are self-help books, right? And he
Ah.
said, you should write a Musashi self-help book. I said, yeah, rubbish. I hate that shit. I absolutely hate that shit. Musashi would hate my ass for doing that because it's just simply a matter of getting out there and doing the training. But that idea stuck with me because he's kind of right. It's like, and it's really the motivation for your question, isn't it? How relevant is this stuff? Well, I think it's very relevant. I think I made that quite clear. But I think the more you look into it, if you've got a vessel to contextualize it with, um, then it really makes a lot of sense. And why not use your life as something that you can contextualize these teachings with? Because that's what Musashi was doing. It wasn't just the sword, it was his whole life. And that was what he was trying to pass on to his students. And so, this rather, what I thought was a simplistic observation, has really started to um, take root in my minuscule brain here, and it's starting to take it. I really want to graduate from Musashi for a while, but
Yeah.
um,
You've been working on it for a
it's
while on this book.
oh
Do you think
God, man.
you think Musashi would be
Uh,
big into YouTube if you're around today?
no, he wouldn't be because, like I said, I think he's very introverted. But he'd
Ah,
be
okay,
great.
fair, fair.
Yeah, he'd be a great guy to get out on the piss and try and get him drunk and get him talking. I think,
That's why
he'd
you're
be into
here.
shots. I'm sure.
That probably
Yeah.
would be good.
So anyway, after this novel is out, next June, I think it is.
Mhm.
Then I think the next book I'll be working on is how do you apply Musashi's techniques to um, everything but martial arts? Because I think there's
Mm.
incredible wisdom there. Of
Mhm.
course, like I said, a lot of it's is not relevant. Uh, because we don't go around killing each other.
Well, most of
Well, at
us.
least I
Yeah.
hope we don't. Yeah. Unfortunately, there are
Ahem.
yeah places in the world where that is not true, um, but certainly, taking that knowledge, which was it was forged in the cauldron of mortal combat. Let's face it, and that's
Yeah.
the fact. You don't get higher pressure than that. And this is a guy who prevailed, and became a household name,
Right.
throughout the
Right.
centuries in Japan and around the world. There's
Oh
so
yeah.
much to that wisdom that he accrued,
Hmm.
that I think is really relevant. So that's going to be my next project, is how to basically to answer the question you just asked.
Hmm.
That's another podcast, brother.
I'm looking forward to it. You let me know when it's out. We'll talk about that. There's plenty of things. We should maybe do part two of this. We'll talk later about it. We're going close on time, so we're gonna take our final shot. I got one more question for both of you guys. Alex kind of cheated. He'll jump again. Can always drink some more.
Cheers.
I heard that laugh. All right, here we go. All right. Our last question is always something much more casual, much less serious. I'm gonna go with Alex first, then Kekoa. What was your favorite portrayal of Musashi in fiction or real life? Um, or a swordsman inspired by that image of that wandering samurai. My favorite, there's an anime called Samurai Champloo, and they do this kind of Yoda thing where the main character meets this crazy old man who helped kind of trains him indirectly, and at the end he kind of hinted very strongly that he's Miyamoto Musashi, and then he disappears forever. It was one of my favorite portrayals because of how crazy they showed him, but how sane at the same time. Alex, for you, thinking back, what's your favorite portrayal of this guy? And don't say the guy from SMAP, please.
No, I'd never say that. Kimutaku is his name. Um, my favorite portrayal. Well, I guess it. Are you talking specifically uh, visual material, like movies and television programs, or are you talking
Anything.
book?
If it's a painting, a book, anything that you feel captured him the most and impressed you the most and gave you your favorite impression of him.
Wow, that's a tough question. That is. That's a really
Yeah.
tough question. Yeah. Well, I have to say. Maybe if you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd say something different. But as I've been working so hard on the Yoshikawa Eiji novel translation, um, I have. I mean, it's been 6 years of work, and for the last year or so, it's just been that's all I've done. So my obviously when you're translating something like that, you actually have to really have a firm image in your mind of how that character speaks, looks, interacts with other people, because that comes out in the way that you translate uh, the dialogue.
Right.
And so at the moment, I think the way that Yoshikawa Eiji portrayed Miyamoto Musashi as this young wild child who um, suddenly, just uh, has some epiphanies thanks to Takuan, which never happened, by the way,
Right. Right.
because he never met Takuan, and then just dedicated himself single-mindedly, wholeheartedly to the way uh, of the sword. Um, Seeing that transition in the character from the young teenager who was on the battlefield of Sekigahara, right the way through until he goes down to Kyushu, and defeats Sasaki Kojiro in the duel, that defined him, at least according to this popular culture. I really love that
Mm.
story,
Hmm.
even though it is mostly fiction.
Yeah.
And I guess I can also sort of add to that when I was 19 years old, I just got back from Japan. after my first year as an exchange student at high school, where I had been doing kendo for 1 year. That was the first time I ever did kendo. And I got back to New Zealand and started up a kendo club back here, and then started getting very restless because I wanted to, uh, you know, go back and do more kendo and
Hit
uh,
somebody. Yeah.
yeah, and I wanted things to read. We didn't have the internet back then. This is the 1988, 89, right? And um, one book that I discovered through a friend was Yoshikawa Eiji's Miyamoto Musashi, the old English translation that's available. And when I read that, it was just like, oh my God, I've got to get back to Japan. I've got to get back. I've got to do this Mushashugyo thing, just like Musashi was doing. And that's exactly what I did. And that's what's kept me in Japan for, 35 years.
You came
So
over and
that
beat up a bunch of swordsmen, or?
well, get beat up by a bunch of swordsmen, more to the point. But that original Yoshikawa Eiji Musashi, and now I am
Mhm,
revisiting it and doing my own translation of it, and I have a
mhm.
very firm image in my mind of what Yoshikawa Eiji was trying to portray. So a very, very long answer, but yep, that would be it. Yoshikawa Eiji's novel.
It's a great novel, and great Grandmaster Juarez, Kekoa's teacher, my Sigung, he actually introduced me to a book called The Ronin by William Dale Jennings. It's a different story, but it goes similarly to Eiji Yoshikawa's story, and I love it for that. It really represents, coming from Kajukenbo, I think th this attitude of the character of being a young punk and growing older, it does again, but it really resonated with me. Kekoa, how about yourself?
Listening to all these stories, it kind of makes me think about a lot of the plots in a lot of pop culture movies, especially with Bruce Lee movies, right? You see that one movie where Bruce Lee enters the dojo and he just, starts fighting everybody. But aside from Bruce Lee, there's so many other movies that just kind of follow this whole, I'm rushing into the dojo and I'm fighting all these people. And a lot of times they're not even using a real sword. They're using like a wooden sword against all these real weapons that could actually kill them. And they're doing all this. So a lot of those are really pop out into my mind as far as
Hmm.
the best portrayal of
The
Miyamoto
Wandering
Musashi.
Swordsman. Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Kekoa's a
Ronin.
fellow nerd with
Oh,
me, so we talk
yeah.
about this stuff quite a bit. So, all
Yeah,
right, cool.
just for the
Well,
record, just for the record, mate.
yeah.
I think Kekoa, you sort of you look like how I would envisage Miyamoto Musashi in his mid-20s, by the way.
Remember that. That's a good compliment.
Must have been a real handsome guy.
All right, well, this brings us to the end of our show. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. Please comment and share. I only do this show maybe once a year. This is not something I'm trying to make money on, just having fun and getting some information out there. If you do like the show, please comment and share. That is the best way to help us with the algorithms and just get this out there. If you're interested in more common stuff, I'm on Substack. You can find some of my recent writings and connections to my book at the Kajukenbo Philosophy with John Hoylo. Uh, Alex, plug your books. Go for it.
Oh, mate, I'm going to send you some links later, and maybe you can put them up there. But certainly
Definitely.
the Miyamoto Musashi novel, which I really, and I'm not joking, the timing is amazing. I really hope to be able to finish that this evening. Okay, so, and that will be published in June of next year from Tuttle, and it's going to
All
be
right.
massive, three big volumes, 600 pages each. So
Wow.
the difference between my translation and the one that's out there is, well, obviously I speak with correct, English, so you're going to get a lot of Kiwis.
Yeah, there was some problem in that, but yeah, I'll get that.
But it's also non-abridged. It's the full translation, so it's long. So I'll
Ah,
just leave
nice.
it at that. And
Please.
yeah, and if you're interested in Musashi's life, in terms of the historical, what we know as fact and what we know as fiction, if you check out my translation of Gori no Sho, also out by Tuttle, I've got a big introductory section where I go into all of the scholarship into his life and what we can tell is true and what is not.
All right. And yeah, hopefully we get some more. If you guys at home, if you want to hear more about this, because I was hoping to ask many, many more questions. We've just been, the day just passes quickly, especially with shots. Kiko, how about yourself? Anything to plug in? No
Uh,
OnlyFans. Darn.
Not literally, but check out my Instagram. It's at Art by Kekoa. I'll also send you a link to where a lot of my graphic t-shirts and stuff are all for sale at Metal Dragon Co. It's on Etsy. So that'll be up on the links, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah, check him out. He's got some great art. Anybody who's into martial arts, you'll appreciate his aesthetics as we go for it. And that is the end of the show. Tune in next time when Alex tells us about his adventures working undercover as a belly dancer during Cold War era Russia.
How did you know that? How the hell did you find that out?
I got friends. Until then, stay strong, stay Kajukenbo strong. Mahalo.